Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left Thomas, he was settling in as Army Commander. But as the spring of 1864 opened, he would be helping launch one of the most famous campaigns of the war, the Atlanta Campaign. In northern Georgia, Sherman had amassed around 100,000 troops in three different armies. Thomas commanded the largest force, the Army of the Cumberland, with over 60,000 men. Major General James McPherson commanded the 24,000-man Army of the Tennessee, and Major General John Schofield commanded what was called the Army of the Ohio, when in actuality it was 13,000 men organized into a single corps. The Confederate Army of Tennessee under Joseph E. Johnston had around 65,000 men, and Sherman wanted to take advantage of his numerical superiority by using his armies to outmaneuver the Southerners. Sherman liked Thomas's idea of moving through Snake Creek Gap to cut the rail lines south of the Confederate position, but wanted to use the smaller Army of the Tennessee to make the movement, while the Army of the Cumberland held the Confederates in place and Schofield flanked from the north. Johnston was caught off guard by the movement through Snake Creek Gap and began shifting troops to that sector. McPherson hesitated upon nearing Resaca and held back, giving Johnston enough time to create a new defensive line near that town. Thomas suggested to Sherman that they should try another flanking maneuver to force Johnston out of his defenses and closer to Atlanta. Sherman rejected that idea and ordered Thomas to attack. George used two of his corps to attack Johnston, but was thrown back and got counterattacked. His men threw back the rebels, but no ground was gained. Meanwhile, a small group of Federals had gotten around Johnston's flank. Thinking a larger body of men was about to separate him from Atlanta, Johnston withdrew. Sherman used the Snake Creek Gap strategy of pushing farther to the west and attempting to cut Johnston's supply line off, while holding on to and repairing his own rail line to deliver supplies and reinforcements. Sherman attacked Johnston's army near New Hope Church on May 25th and again at Pickett's Mill on May 27th, but both attacks failed with heavy losses. Sherman's armies then moved back east to the railroad. Throughout these maneuvers, Thomas worked actively to reconnoiter the terrain and coordinate operations of his army, often riding far ahead of his men. One of his staff aides, Henry Stones, recalled that Thomas invariably made his way along to the head of the column. If, when he was at the rear, the sounds indicated contact with the enemy, he pushed on to the very front, where he often dismounted and walked to the outer skirmish line to reconnoiter. Nobody ever saw him with an escort trailing behind, dashing past a moving column of troops, throwing up dust or mud, and compelling them to leave the road to him. If anybody had the right of way, it was they, not he. He would break through the woods or flounder across a swamp rather than force his men from the road, and so wear them out by needless fatigue. At one point during the campaign, an exhausted company fell asleep in the middle of the road. An officer abruptly woke the men up, yelling to them to get out of the road that General Thomas was riding through. Thomas stopped the officer and told them to stay where they were, that they would find another way. Another situation saw Thomas and his staff come under fire from the enemy skirmishers far away from their horses. His staff ran speedily toward their mounts, but Thomas slowly walked, paying no attention to the bullets. This could have been courage, or it could have been that his back injury prevented him from running. But either way, he kept his cool even in the most hazardous situations. Him and Jefferson C. Davis found a patch of blackberries and began to indulge themselves in the delicious fruit. When the two came under fire, this time by Confederate cavalry, instead of running off, Thomas stayed and picked blackberries, only saying to his subordinate, "Davis, this is eating blackberries under difficulties." As the Union armies backed Johnston up to Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman sent General Hooker's corps of Thomas's command and Schofield to the west to attempt another flanking maneuver. When Hooker ran into the corps of General John Bell Hood, he reported to Thomas that he had 3 Confederate corps in front of him. Thomas exclaimed that the whole enemy army only had 3 corps, so that was impossible. But he did advise Hooker to dig in at a place called Kolb's Farm, where Hood ordered unsuccessful attacks against the Union troops on June 22nd. Sherman and Grant kept up communication with one another, and when the subject of how slow the progress was to capture Atlanta came up, Sherman blamed Thomas. He said, "My chief trouble is with the Army of the Cumberland, which is awful slow. A fresh furrow in a plowed field will stop the whole column, and all begin to entrench. I have again and again tried to impress on Thomas that we must assail and not defend. We are on the offensive, and yet it seems the whole Army of the Cumberland is so habituated to be on the defensive that, from its commander down to its lowest private, I cannot get it out of their heads." The critique was unfair. All of the Union armies during the campaign were slow and hesitant to launch themselves against the heavily fortified enemy. When the Confederates entrenched on Kennesaw Mountain, Thomas suggested that Sherman move to the east in another flanking maneuver. Again, Sherman rejected the idea, instead ordered an attack against the fortified high ground. The details were left up to the respective army commanders, so Thomas took a division from two of his corps, letting Oliver Otis Howard coordinate the 4th Corps' attack, and Thomas would direct the movements of one of the 14th Corps' divisions. Thomas personally reconnoitered the ground to find a weak point, but found none, so he determined to attack the Confederate position where it bulged outward to accommodate a hill. Ordering 2 brigades to form into densely packed columns, hoping to weaken or break the position with the first line and capitalize on the breach with the second, the attack began around 8 a.m. on June 27th. By 10:45 a.m., Thomas called off the attack. The Union had suffered around 3,000 casualties in that nearly 3-hour battle. Sherman asked Thomas if the Confederate line could be successfully broken at any location. Thomas replied, "The division commanders report the enemy's works exceedingly strong, in fact so strong they cannot be carried by assault except by immense sacrifice, even if they can be carried at all. I think therefore the best chance is to approach them by regular saps, and if we can find a favorable position, to batter them down. We have already lost heavily today without gaining any material advantage. 1 or 2 more such assaults would use up this army." Sherman decided to outflank Johnston again, this time pushing him all the way to Atlanta. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, replaced Johnston with the more aggressive John Bell Hood, and the new commander would attempt to isolate and land a decisive blow against segments of the Union armies. Hood moved his troops against Thomas's Army of the Cumberland near Peachtree Creek. Thomas's skirmishers detected the presence of the enemy, so old Pap sent John Newton's division to the front to see the force awaiting them, and he would accompany Newton. He also ordered the corps of Hooker and Palmer to come to the front. Both men suspected the situation to be a trap and began to argue with one another about who should go first. When it was determined the enemy had a large force, Thomas ordered Newton's men to dig in, and by that time he placed Hooker and Palmer's corps to the right of Newton's line. Unfortunately, those troops didn't have time to dig in before Hood's attack. One of Hood's units was pressing into the rear of the Union line, threatening to capture the bridge over Peachtree Creek. So Thomas rode across the bridge and brought up additional artillery to post at the bridge to defend it against the Confederate attack. He used the flat side of his saber to spur the artillery horses to a faster pace and arrived just in time for Thomas to direct the cannon fire against the rebel threat, driving the enemy away. Thomas's line held and only temporarily stopped him on his advance toward Atlanta. 2 days later, on July 22nd, Hood attacked the Army of the Tennessee, and it resulted in the death of Major General James McPherson. Sherman now needed a replacement, and he decided on Thomas's corps commander, Oliver Otis Howard. This infuriated Joseph Hooker, Thomas's other corps commander, because he had seniority. This resulted in Hooker handing in his resignation. After a consultation with Thomas, Sherman accepted the resignation. Thomas would then put David S. Stanley in command of the 4th Corps. In late August, Sherman pulled his troops out of the entrenchments and moved west and south to cut the Atlanta and West Point Railroad. This would result in the Battle of Jonesboro, where by September 1st, Sherman had the opportunity to nearly destroy the entire Confederate army, since that army was now separated and vulnerable. Thomas advised Sherman to surround the Confederate corps of Stephen D. Lee and William J. Hardee and close the trap, but he ordered the troops to continue to destroy the railroad instead. An attack did come, but it was too late. Hood would evacuate Atlanta and move his army away from the city, leaving it to Union forces.